Since the NBA introduced the Defensive Player of the Year award in 1983, the league has followed a couple very specific trends when determining the winner of the award. For one, the voters highly favor the center position. Since the award became a thing, a center has won the race 26 out of 41 times. The other major trend is that the league highly favors great defensive players on top-tier teams. In the league's history, 30 out of the 41 winners have played on a top 4 seeded team. And what's even crazier is that each and every one of those 41 winners were on a playoff team. So as you can see, the typical formula for determining the winner is simple, which is essentially who's the best defensive center of the top seeded teams. But what if we said screw the formula and instead simply gave the award to the player who was honestly the best defensive player that season, regardless of what position he played and regardless of how his team finished? Well, if we did that, things would change up quite a bit. Now, prior to the 1980s, the Defensive Player of the Year award did not exist yet in the NBA. Meaning that in the years prior to 1983, I'll be handing out brand new DPOY awards instead of replacing them. I'll be starting in 1957, seeing that was the rookie season of the legendary Bill Russell. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with these choices. In 1957, I'm giving the award to Maurice Stokes. Many of you guys probably don't know who this guy is, but for the short time that he was in the NBA before he had an injury that paralyzed him, Stokes was among the best and most athletic players in the entire league. In some ways, his incredible athleticism was similar to LeBron James, in the sense that he was around 6 foot 8 inches tall and was faster, quicker, and stronger than the vast majority of the competition. He was one of the best rebounders of all time, as he averaged 17.4 rebounds this season, and was excellent at not only playing defense, but positioning himself to get a tremendous amount of defensive rebounds. He led his Royals to be first in points allowed, and they were second overall in defensive rating. Stokes also led the entire league that season in defensive win shares by a massive margin. Obviously, blocks and steals were not accounted for until the 1970s. But if they had been, he certainly would have been among the league leaders in those stats. Bill Russell was definitely in the mix in his rookie season, but because of injuries, he only played in 48 games that season, compared to Stokes, who played all 72. Based on all of this information, the choice is clear. Maurice Stokes takes the award. Now, I really don't want this video to get bogged down and become extremely repetitive and redundant. So for this next part, I'm going to clump together quite a few DPOYs, and it may stun some of you. I'm giving the award to Bill Russell between 1958 and 1967. That's right, you heard me correctly, he is winning the award for 10 straight seasons. Without question, Bill Russell was the greatest defensive player of that era, and many people believe he's the greatest defensive player of all time. He had an endless motor, he played a tremendous amount of minutes, he was all over the court, he was arguably the greatest rim protector of all time, and his defense was consistently leading his team to victories. In all 10 of those seasons straight, Russell led the Celtics to have the best defense in the entire league based on team defensive rating. In all 10 seasons, Russell led the league in defensive win shares. And in several of those seasons, Russell had more than double the amount of win shares than the guy in second place, who was often Wilt Chamberlain. On top of that, Russell regularly contained the best centers in the entire league to more pedestrian numbers. Basketball Hall of Famers like Wilt Chamberlain, Walt Bellamy, and Nate Thurmond were just not producing to the same extent that they normally were when they were matched up against Bill Russell. This wasn't just my opinion, but this was the common belief of the league at that point in history, as everybody fully recognized Bill Russell as the best defensive player in the game, and that was evident based on how they voted for him in the MVP rankings. Despite regularly being tremendously outscored by Wilt Chamberlain, Russell was often the player who was getting the most MVP votes, seeing that was the only way he could be recognized for his defensive impact, since the DPOY award and all defense teams did not yet exist in the NBA. Again, I know it's a massive streak, and it's pretty jaw-dropping to give him 10 straight DPOYs right out of the gates to start this video. But beyond a shadow of a doubt, he was the best defensive player for each and every one of those seasons. In 1968, I'm finally giving the award to someone else, and in this case, it's going to the all-time great rim protector, Wilt Chamberlain. At this point of his career, Chamberlain was less focused on the offensive end of the court, and accepted a reduced role in a more free-flowing offense. He was the starting center for the Philadelphia 76ers, who were in their title defense season, and this year specifically, he was ranked first overall in defensive win shares, well ahead of Bill Russell. Chamberlain played all 82 games compared to Bill Russell's 78, and Wilt led his 76ers to have the best defensive rating in the entire league. Obviously, if blocks and steals had been tracked during that era, then Chamberlain would have had some truly gaudy numbers and would likely be holding block shot records to this very day. With his 7'1" height, with his 7'8" wingspan, and with his tremendous athleticism, stamina, and leaping ability, he was a terrifying rim protector, to go along with the fact that he was a dominant rebounder and, of course, a dominant defensive rebounder. In 1969, I'm giving the award back to Bill Russell, ahead of Nate Thurmond. Bill Russell made his triumphant return to the top spot of the DPOY standings, if you ask me, even though it was his final season in the NBA. That season, he led the league in defensive win shares. He led his Celtics to have the best defensive rating in the entire league. And you also have to consider the fact that he was the player coach of this team at this time. So not only was his rim protection getting it done for them defensively, but he also coached this team to be the best defensive team in the entire league. Obviously, with his greatness and with his competitive spirit, Russell made his Celtics into a successful squad, and triumphantly sailed off into the sunset, ending his legendary career. So in my opinion, not only should he have 11 championship rings, but he should have an astonishing 11 DPOY awards. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I gotta give a shout out to one of the greatest defensive players of all time, Nate Thurmond, who regularly did a great job of containing Wilt Chamberlain. Thurmond was one of the strongest, most intimidating, and most formidable defensive players of all time. Unfortunately, he's not leaving this decade with any DPOY awards, simply for the existence of Bill Russell. In 1970, I'm giving the award to the New York Knicks superstar Willis Reed. This New York legend was one of the best two-way players of his era, and in this season specifically, he had his greatest impact on the defensive end. New York finished the regular season with a 60-22 record while finishing first in points allowed and first in defensive rating. The lion's share of that credit belongs to Reed, who played in 81 out of the 82 games. He was easily first overall in defensive win shares that season, and was first team all-defense for the center position. His teammate Walt Frazier and the Lakers legend Jerry West were both legitimate candidates for the award as well, but if you ask me, the data points to Reed as the most deserving candidate. In 1971, I'm giving the award to another Knicks star, Dave DeBusschere. The Knicks of the 1970s were absolutely stacked, especially defensively. Dave was a 6'6" power forward who was a double-double machine throughout his playing days. This guy was famous for playing with hustle and heart. His grit and grind attitude made him a menace defensively, as he smothered offensive players while forcing plenty of turnovers. And as a reward for his 81-game performance, he received the most votes for the NBA's All-Defense team. His Knicks were first in points allowed and second in defensive rating, thanks in large part to his massive impact during his 36 minutes per game. Guys like Jerry West and Nate Thurmond were in the mix as well, but in my opinion, Dave had everything needed to be the Defensive Player of the Year winner. In 1972, the dominant Wilt Chamberlain gets the DPOY. For me, this is the obvious choice. The 71-72 Lakers had a historic record-setting season, where they won 33 straight regular season games, and finished the year with a 69-13 record. This group had plenty of great offensive weapons, like Jerry West, Gail Goodrich, and Jim McMillan. With a new head coach in Bill Sharman, who implemented a more up-tempo fast break offense, it allowed Chamberlain to focus even more of his energy on his rim protection and defensive rebounding. His scoring dropped 6 points per game from the previous season, but in return, it was the best rim protection that Los Angeles has ever had. Unfortunately, blocks and steals were not yet officially tracked at this point in history. But if they had been, they likely would have been some of the most insane defensive numbers that we've ever seen. In 1973, I'm giving the award to Wilt Chamberlain for the second straight season. At the age of 36, this was technically the final season of Wilt Chamberlain's career. But that didn't stop him from leading the league in rebounding at 18.6 per game, while playing all 82 games that season. Wilt was his usual monstrous self as a shot blocker, as he led his Lakers to a 60-22 record while finishing as the third best team in defensive rating. Dave Cowens of the Boston Celtics finished as a close second, as he led the best team in the league to have the best defensive rating overall. But when you consider their individual impact and Wilt's all-time great shot blocking, I still think he's the correct choice even in his final season. In 1974, I'm giving the award to the Knicks star Dave DeBusschere for a second time. At the age of 33, Dave was still as dangerous as ever defensively. He was harassing opposing forwards throughout the course of the season, and he was definitely the best in the eye test department, as he received the most all-defense team votes of any player that season. In a way, Dave was like the Dennis Rodman of the 1970s, in the sense that he didn't have the loudest defensive numbers, yet he still made a tremendous impact with his endless motor and with his harassing on-ball defense. Jerry Sloan of the Chicago Bulls and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar of the Milwaukee Bucks also had tremendous defensive campaigns that I considered. But ultimately, Dave DeBusschere was still a bit too formidable to send the award somewhere else. In 1975, I'm giving the award to the Hall of Fame two-guard Jerry Sloan. He played 78 of the 82 games and helped lead his Bulls to be second in defensive rating and first overall in points allowed. Sloan was one of the best pickpockets of his era, as he was among the league leaders in steals per game, averaging 2.2. He was a lengthy wing who was tenacious and who never stopped moving defensively. He forced plenty of players into bad decisions, which is why he earned his spot on the NBA's all-defense team. The usual candidates were also in the mix, like Walt Frazier, John Havlicek, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but as far as I can tell, Jerry Sloan was the cream of the crop this season. In 1976, I'm giving the award to the all-time great center, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He's been close to winning it a couple of times up to this point, but in this season especially, he dominated the rest of the competition defensively. This was the famous season where he won the MVP award despite the fact that his Lakers missed the playoffs. But that was mostly due to his lack of talented support, rather than being an indication of his own shortcomings. Kareem played all 82 games while averaging a monstrous 4.1 blocks per game, which also led the entire league that season. Along with that, he also averaged an impressive 1.5 steals per game. Beyond all of that, he also dominated the advanced analytics, as he was first in defensive win shares, first in defensive plus-minus, and second overall in defensive rating. I could talk about some of the other candidates, but it's pointless in my mind, since no one was close to the defensive greatness of the captain. In 1977, Bobby Jones of the Denver Nuggets takes home the award. At 25 years old, the man known as the Secretary of Defense was just reaching his prime. And at his prime, he was essentially known as the game's best defender. He was among the league leaders in both steals and blocks per game, and he always gave his best efforts as he ran up and down the floor like a gazelle. Jones was first overall in all defense team voting, and by quite the significant margin. He was also a monster in advanced stats, as he was second in defensive win shares, first in defensive plus-minus, and first overall in defensive rating. Bill Walton was also elite on the defensive end, and he was probably my second choice. The thing is, not only did Bobby have the edge statistically, but he also had the significant edge in availability, as he played in all 82 games compared to Walton's 65. In 1978, I have Bobby Jones repeating as the NBA's Defensive Player of the Year. He played 75 of the 82 games this year, and was honored on the NBA's All-Defense team once again. As usual, he was among the league leaders in blocked shots and steals per game, especially for his position. His team wasn't among the best defensive teams in the league this year, but he was the lone bright spot as he was all over the court with his speed, tenacity, and endurance as he always was. Now, Bill Walton was once again my runner-up, and honestly, if Bill had played 75 games that season just like Jones did, then I probably would have given him the award instead. But the reality is that Bill only played 58 games that season while winning the league MVP. For myself personally, you can't miss nearly a third of a season and still be expected to be seen as the most valuable defender. You provide no value when you're sitting on the bench in street clothes. And for this reason especially, Bobby Jones gets the repeat. In 1979, I'm giving the award to the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for the second time this decade. At 31 years old, Kareem was just as good as ever, as his rim protection was the best in the business. At an athletic 7 foot 2 inches with an even longer wingspan, Kareem was an absolute nightmare for those who challenged him. He averaged a league-leading 4 blocks per game and chipped in 1 steal per game as well. He was extremely available as he played in 80 out of the 82 regular season games. He was also second in defensive win shares behind Jack Sikma and second in defensive plus-minus behind Sam Lacey. Outside of Kareem, there were not many great defensive players on that Lakers squad, so they had to lean heavily upon his interior presence, and it worked tremendously. Guys like Dennis Johnson and Bobby Jones were in the mix as well. But to me, no one was more deserving of the hardware than a prime Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. In 1980, I'm giving the award to the 6'9" power forward Bobby Jones, followed closely by Dennis Johnson of the Seattle Supersonics. For me, Jones was the most deserving defender at the beginning of this decade, as he helped the 76ers finish as the #1 rated defense that season. Well before LeBron James was famous for his chase-down blocks, that was basically the signature move of Bobby Jones, who was commonly referred to as the Secretary of Defense. He was usually Philadelphia's sixth man, but coming off the bench, Jones was an explosion of energy and hustle, and he was a turnover-causing machine, as he averaged 1.3 steals and 1.5 blocks, while smothering offensive players and forcing them into bad shots and bad passes. Ask anyone who's old enough to have watched the NBA during that era, and they'll tell you that Jones was a defensive powerhouse. In 1981, I'm giving the award to the 6'4" combo guard Dennis Johnson, narrowly ahead of the great Bobby Jones. It was DJ's first season with the Phoenix Suns, and he immediately launched them into the #1 spot defensively. He led all players and all defense team voting, and was among the league leaders in most defensive advanced stats. Many Boston Celtics fans will know this guy as the great defensive point guard during their dynasty days, but the truth is, he was even better before that, as he was only 26 years old in Phoenix and had even more quickness at that point. He was among the league leaders in both steals and blocks at his position, as he averaged 1.7 and 0.8 throughout the course of the season. When you look at the defensive numbers between DJ and Bobby Jones, you'll see that it was a very competitive race. But for me, Johnson was just the slightly more deserving candidate on this season specifically. In 1982, I'm giving the award to Bobby Jones once again, ahead of Sidney Moncrief and Michael Cooper. If the award had existed at this point, then Jones most likely would have won it, as he finished with the most voting points among the All-Defense Team finalists. On the year, he averaged 1.3 steals and 1.5 blocks, while bolstering some impressive advanced stats. What also helped his case was the fact that he had a longer impact on the court, since he was now moved into the role of a full-time starter. Guys like Sidney Moncrief and Michael Cooper were their usually stifling selves on the perimeter. But regardless, the Secretary of Defense was widely viewed as the best defender in the game at this point. Now for the years where the award actually existed. In 1983, Sidney Moncrief was named the first ever Defensive Player of the Year, and he's losing the award to the underrated rim protector Tree Rollins. Moncrief was one of the greatest perimeter defenders that the game of basketball has ever seen, and he would often contain opposing stars to numbers well below their usual averages. With that being said, Moncrief did get a significant boost to his DPOY case thanks to his team's overall success. On the other hand, Tree Rollins of the Atlanta Hawks was carrying his team defensively, as he was an anchor in the paint, averaging 4.3 blocks per game on the season. For a single season, that's actually the 10th highest blocks per game average in NBA history. Moncrief just barely finished ahead of Rollins in the DPOY voting, but again, I think that had more to do with the fact that the Bucks were division winners, while the Hawks barely made the playoffs. When you compare their overall defensive statistics side by side to one another, you'll see that there's almost no metric where Moncrief comes out on top. In 1984, Sidney Moncrief won his second straight DPOY, but on my list, he loses the award to the defensive giant Mark Eaton. As usual, Moncrief was the cream of the crop when it came to perimeter defense, as he was regularly putting the clamps on opposing star guards. He just narrowly beat out the 7'4" Utah center, finishing with 19 votes to Mark's 14. But I think most of that can be accredited to the team's overall success. And when you look at the two players head-to-head, you'll see that Mark had the edge in most defensive statistics, including the best defensive plus-minus in the entire league. Mark averaged a whopping 4.3 blocks this season, and only 26 minutes per game. Just imagine what his numbers would have looked like if he had played 36 to 40 minutes. He had a tremendous defensive IQ and communicated well with his teammates on defense. Ultimately, you can't go wrong either way, but for myself personally, I think Mark offered a tad more value than Moncrief in this specific season. In 1985, Mark Eaton won his first official DPOY, and on my list, he's keeping the award, ahead of Sidney Moncrief and Michael Cooper. To put it simply, this wasn't all that close, as Mark had one of the most terrorizing rim-protecting campaigns that the game of basketball has ever seen. In 34 minutes per game, he averaged an NBA record 5.6 blocks throughout the course of the regular season. He had 6 games that year with at least 10 blocks, including a 14-block performance against the Portland Trail Blazers on January 18th. Those are just the ones that he actually swatted, but the shots he contested and altered were way higher than just that. For some perspective, Hakeem Olajuwon finished with the second highest blocks per game average that season, and he had less than half of what Mark averaged. Despite the fact that Utah only finished that season with a 41-41 record, they still had the best defensive rating in the entire league. And of course, the vast majority of that credit belongs to their big man down low. In this case, it isn't even worth talking about second place, because of just how utterly legendary this defensive campaign was from Mark. In 1986, Alvin Robertson was named the Defensive Player of the Year, and he's keeping the award just barely ahead of the 7'7" Manute Bol. Robertson was a 6'2" guard who was an absolute hound on the perimeter. For his size, he was a tremendous shot blocker, but his greatest gifts were his instincts and his remarkably quick hands that made him arguably the greatest pickpocket in league history. In this season specifically, he was especially dangerous as he averaged an NBA record 3.7 steals. He played all 82 games that year, and he got at least 1 steal in 81 out of the 82 games. Talk about defensive consistency. Just slightly behind of Robertson on my list is the rookie Manute Bol, who averaged a monstrous 5 blocks in only 26 minutes per game. The thing is, as many shots as he blocked in the interior, he would sometimes get exploited for his lack of quickness, and sometimes relied too heavily on his length to make up for his subpar lateral speed. By the thinnest of margins, Robertson keeps the award for his all-around defensive prowess. In 1987, Michael Cooper won his only DPOY, but on my list, he loses the award to the constantly tenacious Alvin Robertson. If I'm being honest, I have no problems with the award going to Cooper, as he was arguably the greatest defensive player in Lakers franchise history. But when you boil it all down, I just think Robertson was just a bit better. Cooper won the award with 25 votes to Robertson's 16, but I think most of that was because the voters were blinded by the aspect of team success, as the Lakers had the best record in the league, winning 65 games, while the Spurs didn't even make the playoffs as they won only 28 games. When you look at it on an individual level and do a side-by-side comparison, you'll see that Robertson crushed Cooper by basically every defensive metric. I understand that defense is more than just stats, but when both players seem to have a similar impact just from the eye test, but one guy clearly outpaces the other in every statistical category, then yeah, stats can be a major deciding factor. Mark Eaton and Michael Jordan also had fantastic defensive seasons of their own, and probably deserved a little more credit with the voters. But at the end of the day, I still believe that Robertson was the top of the class in this department, even if the rest of his team sucked. In 1988, Michael Jordan won the Defensive Player of the Year, but on my list, his cheating ass loses the award. Alright, I'm kidding, he keeps it. Obviously, this award has been met with plenty of controversy in recent months, as it appears that Jordan's steals were artificially inflated at home by a biased statistician, which is a topic I covered recently in this video. With that being said, I do believe homebrewed stats were a common issue during that era, and even if you look at his steals average from simply his road games, MJ was still among the league leaders. By far, MJ's most impressive defensive skill from this season was his tremendous shot blocking. I've never seen a guard cover as much of the court defensively as a shot contester. MJ went after everything, and just from watching games, you can tell that his presence was always felt on that end of the court. Much of this was probably because this was the most motivated Michael Jordan had ever been as a defensive player, since he had just lost the race the previous year to Michael Cooper, and Jordan had expressed publicly that angered him and drove him to be better. He certainly wasn't a perfect defensive player, as he often gambled in the passing lanes and was often hunting for blocked shots as the help defender. With that being said, the pros far outweigh the cons. Two all-time great rim protectors in Mark Eaton and Hakeem Olajuwon each had tremendous campaigns of their own. But regardless, MJ still had a better defensive plus-minus and was more historically impressive from the context of his position than these elite centers were from theirs. Without question, MJ was the most deserving candidate. In 1989, Mark Eaton was the Defensive Player of the Year yet again, but on my list, he loses the award to the all-time great Hakeem Olajuwon. This wasn't just a competitive DPOY race, but it was the closest race in NBA history, as Mark had 26 votes, Hakeem had 25 votes, and Dennis Rodman finished third with 23 votes. Once again, I believe the team's success and veteran favoritism had a lot to do with Mark getting the edge over Hakeem. But when you look at their traditional stats and their advanced stats, it's pretty clear that Hakeem was the more dominant force. To go along with Olajuwon's monstrous average of 3.4 blocks, he also averaged an utterly goofy 2.6 steals, which is easily the highest steals per game average by a center in NBA history, and it ranked him 6th overall that season, well ahead of all-time great pickpockets like Scottie Pippen and Maurice Cheeks. Sure, many other candidates did some things well, but the Dream did everything well defensively, while breaking records along the way. In 1990, Dennis Rodman won the DPOY, and he's actually losing the award to Hakeem Olajuwon. This was actually a very, very close race between the Worm and the Dream, as the two combined for 84 of the 92 votes. At the time, the bad boy Detroit Pistons were seen as the best defense in the entire league, which is an aspect that certainly helped Rodman secure the trophy. But if you ask me, he wasn't more deserving than Hakeem on an individual level. For one, Rodman only started in roughly half of the games that season, and he averaged just 29 minutes per game, which I actually think is a detriment to his case, considering the fact that you can't have an impact defensively while you're on the bench. On the other hand, Hakeem averaged 38.1 minutes per game, which was the 9th highest in the entire league. In that time, he averaged 2.1 steals, which was 8th in the entire league, and was easily first among centers, and he also averaged a league-leading 4.6 blocks per game, which is the 5th highest single-season average of all time. By basically every statistical measure, he was the more deserving player. He was first in defensive win shares, first in defensive plus-minus, first in defensive rating, and first in defensive rebounds. On most of these stats, Rodman wasn't even close. Again, I understand that the defensive end is more than just stats, which is especially the case for Dennis Rodman, as he was a specialist when it came to on-ball defense, which doesn't usually show up on the stat sheet. But even with that being considered, I don't see a legitimate reason as to why Hakeem doesn't get the award this season. In 1991, Dennis Rodman won his second straight DPOY, and on this new list, he's keeping the award, ahead of David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon, and Alvin Robertson. Now this year, Rodman's victory made a lot more sense, as he spent more minutes on the floor, he started in 77 out of the 82 games he played, and there was no one competing against him who was nearly as impressive as Hakeem was from the previous season. In 1991 especially, Rodman was the engine that drove the Pistons' defense. Unlike his fellow stars who were reaching the twilight of their careers, Rodman was at his prime age and was providing the very best of his energy and athleticism on a nightly basis. It's also worth mentioning that this version of Rodman was one of the most versatile defenders that we've ever seen, as he spent time defending point guards like Magic Johnson, shooting guards like Michael Jordan, small forwards like Larry Bird, and he even had strength to guard power forwards like Charles Barkley and Karl Malone. There were some other solid candidates, but for me, Rodman stood out amongst the crowd. In 1992, David Robinson was voted as the league's top defender, but on my list, he narrowly loses the award to Dennis Rodman. This was yet another extremely close race, as the two greats were separated by only a total of 7 votes. Robinson will go down as one of the most impressive losers of this entire series, as he was a rim-protecting monster for San Antonio that year. Over the course of the season, he averaged a monstrous 2.3 steals and 4.5 blocks per game, which were the best averages among centers that season. His 47-win Spurs likely don't even make the playoffs if it wasn't for his defensive impact. But here's the thing, Robinson only played in 68 games that regular season, compared to Rodman, who played all 82. That's instantly 14 games guaranteed where Dennis had a greater defensive impact. In terms of blocks and steals, Rodman's averages were as underwhelming as ever, but concerning his suffocating on-ball defense, he was in peak shape. That year, he actually led the league in defensive win shares with a total of 7, which was not only the best in the NBA, but it was actually the highest single-season total of his entire Hall of Fame career. I have no issues with anyone who wants to pick the Admiral, but for myself personally, the best ability is availability, and for that reason especially, Rodman gets the edge yet again. In 1993, Hakeem Olajuwon won his first official DPOY, and on my list, he keeps the award, well ahead of David Robinson and Michael Jordan. Typically, Dennis Rodman would have been in this mix as well, but a combination of injuries and off-the-court issues caused him to play in only 62 games that season. Unlike the last 2 seasons before this, Olajuwon played in all 82 games, and he was his usual two-way dominant self in those contests. His 1.8 steals were once again first among centers, and his 4.2 blocks led the entire NBA, and by quite a wide margin. Houston was a top 3 team defensively in both points allowed and defensive rating, and there's no question that they wouldn't have been close to those rankings without the Dream in the middle. David Robinson and Michael Jordan tied for second, and if Olajuwon wasn't in the league, then that would have been a tough choice. But with Olajuwon's usual dominance, there's really not much reason to elaborate further. In 1994, Hakeem Olajuwon won the award yet again, and he keeps the award in what was likely the most competitive race in DPOY history. Here's a breakdown of how the voting went. Hakeem took the top spot with 24 votes. Robinson finished second with 23 votes, then Mutombo with 19, Pippen with 11, Gary Payton with 9, and Dennis Rodman with 8. Honestly, these were basically all the usual suspects from the 1990s, and there's probably a solid argument for any one of these players. But I think they got it right by giving the slight edge to Olajuwon. As usual, he had the highest combination of blocks and steals in the entire league. He played 80 out of the 82 games, and of the top 3 candidates, he was leading in defensive win shares and defensive rating. If you care more about the eye test than the actual stats, then simply ask any longtime Rockets fan just how good Hakeem Olajuwon was in 1994, and they'll never stop singing his praises. In 1995, Dikembe Mutombo won his first DPOY, but on my list, he's losing the award to the all-time great Scottie Pippen. Mount Mutombo certainly has an argument, as he was in elite form with his Denver Nuggets, and on the year, he averaged 0.5 steals and a league-leading 3.9 blocks. He carried his Nuggets on that end of the court, as they didn't have many good defensive players outside of him, which was one of the major reasons why they only finished with a 41-41 record. On the other hand, there's Scottie Pippen, whose value cannot be overstated. This season, Pippen averaged a league-leading 2.9 steals and a team-leading 1.1 blocks, as he is one of only 5 players to lead his team in all 5 major stat categories over the course of a season. He was also extremely clutch that year for Chicago on defense, and in several one-possession games, he was making key stops down the stretch. I can appreciate an argument in favor of either player, but for me, Pippen's season was more historically impressive in the grand scheme of things. In 1996, Gary Payton won his first and only DPOY, and he's keeping it ahead of Scottie Pippen, David Robinson, and Dikembe Mutombo. The glove led his Sonics to a 64-18 record while having the second best defense in the entire league, trailing only the 72-10 Bulls. It was Payton that gave Seattle their tenacious and energetic identity. Without question, he's an all-time great defender, and this season specifically was where he was at his very best. On the year, he averaged 2.9 steals, which was a career high, and he led the entire NBA that season. He also finished with more defensive win shares than Scottie Pippen and Dikembe Mutombo, who were the players in second and third place. Whether it was the stats, the eye test, or the amount of value to his team, the glove gets the edge for me. In 1997, Dikembe Mutombo won the DPOY, and on this new list, he keeps the award ahead of Gary Payton and Mookie Blaylock. It was his first season with the Atlanta Hawks, but at that point in his career, it didn't matter where Mutombo was. He was gonna use his insane length and his impressive instincts to contest just about every shot in the painted area. The 30-year-old Mutombo led the league in most advanced stats on the defensive end, all while putting up 3.3 blocks per game. Gary Payton wasn't quite as amazing as he was in '96, but regardless, any year where the glove is in his 20s, he's gonna be in the mix. Ultimately, the finger-wagging Mutombo was just too elite at this point for me to even think about sending the award someplace else. In 1998, Dikembe Mutombo won his second straight DPOY, and he's keeping the award once again ahead of Gary Payton. This was yet another insanely close race, as Dikembe finished with 39 votes while Payton had just 37. Honestly though, the race was extremely similar to the year prior. Both players played all 82 games, and the defensive numbers they put up were extremely similar as well. Regardless, I believe Mutombo was still a more intimidating defensive player at this point in his career, and with his 3.4 blocks per game, it's certainly hard to argue otherwise. Gary was still a worthy candidate, but his steals, his defensive plus-minus, and many other defensive aspects of his game had declined since the previous 2 seasons, which is another reason why Mutombo keeps his edge. In 1999, Alonzo Mourning won his first DPOY, and he keeps the award, finally taking attention away from Mutombo and Peyton. Alonzo had always been a great defensive player throughout his career, but specifically in this lockout-shortened season, Mourning took his defensive performances to another level entirely. Because of the lockout, the 98-99 NBA season didn't start until February 5th of 1999. This meant that teams had to play a grueling schedule of 50 games in just a few months. Alonzo was a player who dealt with this brutal schedule better than most, and on the year, he averaged a league-leading 3.9 blocks per game. All-time great rim protectors like Dikembe Mutombo, Hakeem Olajuwon, and David Robinson averaged 1 to 1.5 blocks less than Mourning, which tells you the shot-swatting season that he was having. You could try to make an argument for another player, but for me, Alonzo was in a league of his own defensively in '99. In 2000, Alonzo Mourning won the Defensive Player of the Year, and he's keeping the award just barely ahead of Shaquille O'Neal. Mourning has been on the embarrassing end of some of the most amazing poster dunks in NBA history, but the reason for that is simple. It's because he was such a fierce rim protector who was willing to contest anything and everything. In 79 games played that regular season, Mourning averaged a whopping 3.7 blocks, which was the highest single-season average of that entire decade. Shaquille O'Neal was a solid runner-up for the award, as he averaged 3 blocks of his own. But he also did it in 5 more minutes per game, which really emphasizes just how impactful Mourning was when he was on the court. In 2001, Dikembe Mutombo was given the DPOY, but on this new list, he's losing the award to Tim Duncan. Ultimately, Mount Mutombo deserves a ton of credit for how he had an impact for both the Hawks and 76ers that season. If I'm truly being honest though, that award felt like a recognition of his team's surprising success rather than him being genuinely the most deserving candidate. On the season, the 34-year-old averaged 2.7 blocks and 0.4 steals on 75 games played. But by nearly every statistical measure, the 24-year-old Duncan was the more deserving player. Sure, Mutombo averaged a bit more blocks, but Duncan averaged more steals, he had more defensive win shares, he had a better defensive plus-minus, he had a much better defensive rating, his Spurs were the #1 ranked defense thanks mostly to his impact, and he played all 82 games that season. Honestly, of all the players who were losing the award on this list, this was one of the easier decisions. In 2002, Ben Wallace won the DPOY, and he's keeping the award well ahead of Kevin Garnett. It was at this point that the 27-year-old Big Ben firmly established himself as the best defender in the NBA, and it wasn't all that close. Even as an undersized center at 6'9", he was a terrorizing force, as his strength was matched by none, and his tenacity was present every night. On the year, he averaged 1.7 steals, which was ranked 15th in the entire league, and he averaged 3.5 blocks, which was easily first in all of the NBA. He was also ranked first in defensive win shares, first in defensive plus-minus, and first in defensive rating. Thanks to this season-long performance, he secured 116 of the 120 votes. And seriously, it should be considered a crime that he didn't become the first unanimous winner in NBA history. In 2003, Ben Wallace won the DPOY award, and he keeps the award ahead of Ron Artest, Tim Duncan, and Kevin Garnett. And it was definitely deserved, as he did pretty much everything for his Pistons on the defensive end of the floor. He led the NBA in defensive rebounds, he was second in blocks, and he led all centers in steals. He was first in defensive rating, first in defensive plus-minus, and first in defensive win shares. Again, as I mentioned when I started discussing this season, several players had a really strong defensive campaign. But in comparison to the dominant Ben Wallace at his defensive peak, the gap is quite significant. In 2004, Ron Artest won the DPOY, as he led his Pacers to the best record in the NBA. But alas, he loses the award to Ben Wallace. I always found it amazing how Ben Wallace won the award 4 times in 5 seasons. Yet the one time he didn't win the award was when his team had arguably the greatest defensive season in basketball history. 2 major aspects probably played a factor. For one, voter fatigue was almost certainly an aspect to many voters. And second, Artest probably got the edge because it was basically a reward for his team being the top seed. But when you look at the statistics, the advanced stats, and the defensive rankings overall, Wallace almost always had the edge, as he averaged a higher combined total of steals and blocks. He had more defensive win shares, a better defensive plus-minus, and a better defensive rating. Add on the fact that he played 8 more games than Artest, and add on that he was the driving force behind his team setting a plethora of defensive records, and yeah, it's clear that he should have won his 3rd straight, even if you don't include his impact in that postseason. In 2005, Ben Wallace won the award, and on this new list, he's actually losing the award to the tenacious Bruce Bowen. This was actually a very close race between the 2 players, as Wallace finished with 45 first-place votes, while Bowen finished with 33. From a surface level standpoint statistically, the race wasn't all that close, as Wallace averaged significantly more blocks and steals. With that being said, Big Ben's defensive production had taken a small step backwards since the previous 3 seasons. Then there was Bruce Bowen, who was actually very similar to the great Dennis Rodman in the sense that his great defense wasn't about his stats, but rather it was about his smothering on ball defense that didn't always show up on the stat sheet, or at least on the surface level of the stat sheet. At the time, the best wing scorers in the league were Tracy McGrady, LeBron James, Vince Carter, and Kobe Bryant. In the 4 matchups against Bowen, T-Mac averaged 27.2 points on just 38.8% shooting. In LeBron's 2 matchups against Bowen, he averaged just 21.5 points on 39% shooting from the field. In 3 matchups, Vince Carter averaged 20 points on 39.2% shooting. And in 3 matchups, Kobe Bryant averaged only 20 points on an awful 33.3% from the field. This man was legitimately shutting down the best perimeter players in the game all season long, all while playing for the #1 ranked defensive team that season. And he also played all 82 games, while Wallace just played 74. For me, that is an impact worthy of taking home the award. In 2006, Ben Wallace won his 4th Defensive Player of the Year, and on my list, he's keeping it ahead of Bruce Bowen, Andre Kirilenko, Tim Duncan, and Marcus Camby. Once again, Detroit was a top 2 team defensively, and of course, leading the charge was their 6'9" center. On the season, he averaged a whopping 1.8 steals per game, which was ranked 10th in the league overall, and that was also first among centers by quite a margin. He was doing his usual thing as a rim protector, as he averaged 2.2 blocks per game, which was 9th place overall. It was certainly a crowded race with many strong candidates for the honor, but ultimately, Wallace did the best mix of everything in order to gain the well-deserved edge. In 2007, Marcus Camby won his first and only DPOY, and he's keeping the award just slightly ahead of Tim Duncan. On one hand, the big fundamental did play 10 more games than Camby, but the big man in Denver was a shot-blocking machine for a Nuggets team that highly depended on his elite rim protection. For the 2nd straight season, he led the league in blocks per game with an impressive 3.3 per night. He also added in 1.2 steals per game, making him a reliable turnover-forcing machine. Tim Duncan did play for the better defensive team overall, and some of his advanced stats were a little better as well, But a lot of those stats are influenced by the supporting cast. Camby had to completely carry the Nuggets defensively, as their starting unit has several defensive liabilities, including Carmelo Anthony and Allen Iverson. For his tremendous effort and value, he's certainly worth the award. In 2008, Kevin Garnett won the only DPOY of his career, and as great as he was, he's losing the award to Marcus Camby. There's no question that Garnett's defensive energy and intensity helped that Celtics team be as great as they were on that end of the court, as they finished with a 67-15 record and had the best defensive rating of any team that season. But again, that was a collective effort. Meanwhile, Camby continued to be the pivotal anchor of Denver's defense. He averaged a whopping 3.6 blocks per game. On top of that, he played 79 games that regular season, compared to Garnett, who played just 71. In the 11 games that Garnett didn't play, the Celtics still remained an elite defensive team, as they went 9-2 while keeping teams under 94 points per game. The same certainly could not be said for Camby, as the team had no strong defensive presence if he wasn't in the lineup. In 2009, Dwight Howard won his first of many DPOYs, and on my list, he keeps the award ahead of LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Ron Artest. The voters didn't consider this to be a close race, and honestly, neither do I. At the young age of 23, his athleticism and impact took a tremendous leap forward from the previous year, and with his monstrous vertical leaps, it seemed as if nothing was out of his range when it came to his shot blocking. He led the league in that category as he averaged 2.9 blocks to go along with his 1 steal per game. He also led the league in total defensive rebounds and was widely viewed as the most intimidating player in the paint that year. There may be an argument for someone else, but for myself personally, this was one of the easier choices. In 2010, Dwight Howard won the DPOY, and he's keeping the award ahead of LeBron James and Josh Smith. This one wasn't much of a contest, as Howard led the league in many key categories, including blocks per game, defensive rebounds, defensive win shares, defensive plus-minus, and defensive rating. At 24 years old, he was at the peak of his athletic abilities, as nothing seemed out of his reach, considering how Dwight had one of the highest verticals in the game regardless of his size. It was thanks to his incredible rim protection that his Orlando Magic finished as a top 3 team defensively. On top of all of that, Howard played all 82 games that season, and none of the other finalists in the top 7 spots could make that claim. Again, there was some great defensive seasons from guys like Josh Smith, LeBron James, Gerald Wallace, and even Ron Artest in the second half of his career. But ultimately, no one had a campaign incredible enough to be a legitimate threat to Dwight in his physical prime. In 2011, Dwight Howard won his 3rd straight DPOY, and once again, he's keeping the award, ahead of Tony Allen and Kevin Garnett. Specifically, in the case of Allen, he didn't receive as much consideration as he should have got since his Grizzlies were not a top-seeded team. But with that being said, he was quite impressive, as he was regularly causing problems for some of the best wing scorers in the entire league. Beyond his stifling on-ball defense, he was also 5th in the league overall in steals per game. I was very close to giving this award to Allen for his amazing defensive skills that go beyond the stat sheet. But ultimately, I think Howard's case remains too strong. Dwight once again led the league in many crucial categories, like defensive rating, defensive rebounds, and defensive win shares. He was 4th overall in blocks per game at 2.4, and he also led all centers in steals per game with 1.4, which was actually 18th in the league overall. If the best ability is availability, then Dwight was once again dominating that category, as he played in 78 of the 82 regular season games, which was by far the most game of any of the top 6 finalists. Even when dismissing the built-in advantages for centers, I still believe Dwight was slightly the best defender in the league overall this season. In 2012, Tyson Chandler was awarded the DPOY, but on this list, he's losing the award to LeBron James. Several candidates had a solid case for the award. For example, Serge Ibaka led the NBA in blocks per game at 3.7, regardless of the fact that he only played 27 minutes per game. Kevin Garnett led the league in defensive rating while leading his Celtics to be the best defensive team in the league statistically. Of course, Tyson Chandler had an argument for being the best rim protector in the league that year, which is why he ended up winning the award. But for me, the best defender overall that season, regardless of position, was the athletically dominant LeBron James. At 27 years old, James was right along his peak in terms of speed, strength, and leaping ability, but he was also the defensive engine of that extremely elite Miami group, as the Heat finished as a top 4 team defensively. This was also the season where LeBron showed small glimpses of his defensive versatility by successfully guarding bigs in the post as good as the 7-foot Pau Gasol. He played in 62 of the 66 games in that lockout-shortened season, and in that time, he was all over the court, as he averaged a whopping 1.9 steals and 0.8 blocks. That steals average was the 3rd most in the league overall, and the 2nd highest of his career. He had the best defensive plus-minus in the entire league and had a better defensive rating than the top 2 finalists, which were Tyson Chandler and Serge Ibaka. To me, this season is one of the great examples of the natural advantages for rim protecting centers, because when you look at what they accomplished relatively to their position, LeBron was clearly more deserving than Chandler. In 2013, Marc Gasol was named the Defensive Player of the Year, and he's keeping the award ahead of LeBron James. Now, this is certainly one of the most controversial awards in basketball history, and the reason for the controversy is because although Marc Gasol was selected as the Defensive Player of the Year, he simultaneously only finished on the NBA's second all-defense team. This makes some people think that LeBron was nefariously snubbed, because how can someone be the Defensive Player of the Year if they weren't even voted as the best defender at their position? Well, it's quite simple. 2 different groups voted. Gasol was voted as the best defensive player by members of the media, while NBA coaches voted for him to be on the second all-defense team. Personally, in this specific instance, I agree with the members of the media. Marc was the defensive anchor of that Grizzlies team, and despite the Heat finishing with a much better record overall, it was the Grizzlies who had the better defensive team statistically, as they finished with the second best defense in the entire league compared to Miami, who was ranked 9th. I get it, that's a team stat, for sure. But Marc was the driving interior force of that defense. Even on an individual level, by nearly every advanced statistical metric, Gasol had a better defensive season than LeBron. He had more defensive win shares, he had a higher defensive rating, and he had the best defensive plus-minus in the entire league, on top of the fact that he played more games than LeBron. If you're simply looking at blocks and steals, then yeah, Gasol might not have an argument as good as LeBron or Serge Ibaka, but defense is a lot more than just that. And Marc proved that this season, with his tremendous defensive IQ, with his communication on D, and with his solid rim protection and contention. In 2014, Joakim Noah won his first and only DPOY, and he's keeping the award ahead of DeAndre Jordan and Roy Hibbert. Now once again, the voters made this selection as a recognition of the Bulls' top 2 defense, and I would argue that Tom Thibodeau deserved a ton of credit for that as well. With that being said, from a player's perspective, giving the majority of the credit to Noah was the correct decision. He was an absolute pest to opposing bigs that season, consistently giving them very little space to operate. On the year, he averaged 1.2 steals and 1.5 blocks, while being first overall in defensive win shares, first overall in defensive rating, and second overall in defensive plus-minus. When you look at the voting disparity, it wasn't even all that close, and I honestly feel the same way. I will say that this wasn't the most competitive season, as guys like Ibaka, Dwight Howard, and even Marc Gasol took significant steps backwards from the previous season. Regardless, the award is secure with Noah nonetheless. In 2015, Kawhi Leonard narrowly won his first DPOY, But on my list, he loses the award to Draymond Green. Yes, Kawhi Leonard had a great defensive season, but for myself personally, this seemed like one of the more obvious overturns in this series. For one, Kawhi didn't play very much. He participated in 64 games, which would disqualify him from winning an award by modern-day rules. And his 64 games is actually the second fewest in NBA history for a winner in a full-length season. Another interesting detail is that Kawhi didn't even have the most first-place votes, but that was actually Draymond by quite a bit. But because voters placed their votes with specific rankings, Kawhi was able to win based on the overall points. Draymond participated in 15 more regular season games. His team had the best defensive rating, and he had more defensive win shares than Kawhi. Draymond averaged 1.6 steals and 1.3 blocks, which is a very impressive number coming from a 6'6 player. And when you consider how he was the vocal defensive leader of that first-seeded Warriors team, he deserves even more credit. Again, we understand the kind of defender that Kawhi was in San Antonio, but defense is worth nothing if you're on the bench or sitting at home. So for this reason especially, Draymond Green was the more deserving player. In 2016, Kawhi Leonard once again defeated Draymond Green in a close race, but this time he's keeping the award. The Warriors had an NBA record 73-9 season, yet Kawhi Leonard and the San Antonio Spurs still had a better team defense statistically. They had a great defensive team overall, but without question, the majority of that credit belonged to the game's top wing defender, Kawhi Leonard. He had more win shares, a better defensive rating, and a better defensive plus-minus than Draymond. On the year, Kawhi averaged 1.8 steals and a career-high 1 block, and a much more worthy 72 games played. Although Draymond has his own case, Golden State's success that season had more to do with their incredibly prolific and efficient offense that was breaking league records, as the Warriors finished with only the 5th best defensive rating despite their 73-9 record. At the end of the day, Kawhi was the smart choice in this race. In 2017, Draymond Green was named the Defensive Player of the Year, and he's keeping the award ahead of Rudy Gobert and Kawhi Leonard. After the addition of Kevin Durant, the Warriors dominated basketball like it was clockwork, and I think that historic team effort overshadowed what may have been Draymond's best season from a defensive standpoint. With his offensive role reduced, he was enabled to focus even more of his energy and intensity on the defensive end. He averaged 2 steals per game, which led the entire league that season, and he averaged 1.4 blocks per game. Both of those averages were career highs. Along with that, he had the best defensive plus-minus in the entire league, and frankly, it wasn't all that close. Rudy Gobert was the runner-up, and rightfully so, as it was a typical season for him of elite rim protection, but there was simply no one as deserving as Green this season. In 2018, Rudy Gobert won his first of many DPOYs, but on this list, he loses the award to the former Pelicans star Anthony Davis. I gotta be real with you guys, and I'm not gonna mince words. This DPOY selection was the most egregious I have ever seen, period, point blank. It's not because Gobert isn't an all-time great rim protector, because he certainly is, but it's because he only played a measly 56 games out of the 82-game regular season. The only season where a DPOY played less was Alonzo Mourning in 1999, and it was literally impossible for him to play as many games as Gobert because it was a lockout-shortened 50-game season. The guy they voted as the runner-up was Joel Embiid, who only played 63 games that season. Both of those players would be ineligible by modern-day rules. For me, Anthony Davis was the most deserving candidate. He played 75 games that season, which is a rare miracle by his standards. Davis led the league in defensive win shares and blocks per game at 2.6, and he was 15th in the entire league in steals per game at 1.5. Sure, Gobert had a better defensive rating than AD, and you could even say that he was the better rim protector if you want. But did his value make up for the 20-game gap between him and Davis? Personally, I have no idea what the voters were thinking this season. In 2019, Rudy Gobert won his second straight DPOY, and this time he's keeping the award ahead of Giannis. This season, Gobert led his Jazz to have the second best defense in the entire league, and availability was no issue, as he played in 81 of the 82 regular season games. Throughout that time, his gravitational effect on opposing teams could be clearly seen, as he averaged 2.3 blocks per game and 0.8 steals, while leading the entire league in defensive win shares. Giannis and Embiid had their own strong showings, but with significantly less games played. Ultimately, when a young Gobert is out there and healthy for the majority of the season, he's darn near impossible to beat. In 2020, Giannis Antetokounmpo won the DPOY award, and he's keeping the award ahead of Anthony Davis and Rudy Gobert. Giannis was visibly the best help defender in the entire league this season, as his speed, athleticism, length, and quickness allowed him to cover a tremendous amount of ground, and challenge plenty of shots and disrupt plenty of passes. He didn't have the most overwhelming blocks and steals numbers, but his impact went well beyond the basic stats, and that was indicated with the advanced stats, which he dominated. That year, Giannis had the best defensive rating in the entire league. He also had the best defensive plus-minus and the most defensive win shares in the entire league. Beyond the fact that he was the deserving DPOY candidate, I think this was also a top 12 greatest defensive season in NBA history. In 2021, Rudy Gobert yet again won the Defensive Player of the Year, and he's keeping the award ahead of Ben Simmons and Draymond Green. Of all the players that received DPOY votes that season, Gobert easily had the most games played. And as I say plenty of times in my videos, the best ability is availability. That year, he led the league in total blocked shots, and he also led the league in defensive win shares and in defensive rating. Overall, the NBA was the most inefficient when teams were playing against the Utah Jazz. And obviously, the player who deserves the most credit for that is none other than Rudy Gobert. Beyond the fact that he led the league in blocked shots, he altered plenty of them, and his mere presence kept many players from attacking the rim and challenging him due to his tremendous rim protection. In 2022, Marcus Smart won the Defensive Player of the Year, and he keeps the award ahead of Rudy Gobert. This one was an insanely tight race, as 5 guys finished with double-digit first-place votes. Now, Smart's perimeter defense was tremendous, as he helped the Celtics finish in the first spot for points allowed and in the second spot for defensive rating. He was among the league leaders in steals per game at 1.7, but much of his defensive impact goes well beyond the stat sheet, as he would frequently force players into bad passes and into bad shot attempts. There is a term in basketball that a mad player is a bad player, and Smart would often make players mad with his antics and with his frustrating defensive tendencies. He was also elite at drawing charges from the offensive player. To me, there is zero question who the best defensive player was this season. In 2023, Jaren Jackson Jr. won the DPOY, but on my list, he's losing the award to the Milwaukee Bucks center Brook Lopez. Now, there is certainly a strong argument that Jaren was the best rim protector when he was out there on the court this season, as he averaged 1 steal and 3 blocks per game. He was an absolute hound around the rim, and was challenging basically everything and held down the paint for his Memphis Grizzlies. On the other hand, Brook Lopez averaged 0.5 steals and 2.5 blocks. Jackson was the league's leader in blocks per game, and there's no question about his interior impact. But he only played 63 games that season, which is under the 65-game minimum that was recently instated. Meanwhile, Brook Lopez played 78 games that year, which is a total of 15 more games than Jaren Jackson. I get it. Some people are going to argue that Jackson was the better defender when he was actually out there on the court. But is that enough to make up for the 15 extra games where Lopez was making a tremendous impact defensively for one of the best teams and best defensive teams in the entire league? Personally, I don't believe so. Again, I fully recognize that several players deserve some credit for the Bucks' elite defense that season, but Brook was holding down the paint and being an elite rim protector, while playing in almost every game that season. Personally, I think that's the strongest case of the mix. In 2024, Rudy Gobert won yet another DPOY, but on my list, he's losing the award to the rookie Victor Wembanyama. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, a player has never won the DPOY award while missing the playoffs, but Wemby very nearly became the first. In less than 30 minutes played per game, Victor Wembanyama averaged a ridiculous amount of blocks, which led the league overall. His per 36 minutes stats get even goofier. Yes, Gobert had the advanced stats and had the team success on his side, and the fact that the Spurs lost so many games almost certainly was the reason why Wemby wasn't more seriously considered. But again, you have to look at the team overall. And although I was okay with Gobert getting the award based on his team's success, this entire series has been focused on removing that element and focusing purely on who was the best defensive player regardless of team success. If you look at the Spurs' overall defensive rankings when Wemby was on the court compared to when he was not on the court, it's very clear just how tremendous his defensive impact was. Then you look at the eye test and see how players were responding to his tremendous length and blocking abilities. A 7'5" player with tremendous quickness and instincts with even greater length is certainly going to be scaring plenty of players away from the paint. And that's what we saw time and time again. In reality, I was okay with the award going to Gobert because I do think it's good to recognize winning. But for this video series specifically, we're putting aside that and looking at purely who was the best defensive player regardless of position and regardless of team success. And if you ask me, I don't care if he was a rookie and I don't care how many games they lost, that was obviously Victor Wembanyama in 2024. So a recent theme of this channel has been the topic of defense. And while I was considering what videos I should make, I realized that I've never done the top 10 DPOY seasons in NBA history. So that's where this video comes in, starting with number 10, Alonzo Mourning in 1999. He was 28 years old and playing for the Miami Heat, and this guy usually isn't appreciated enough as being one of the greatest rim protectors in the history of the game. For myself personally, I think he should have made it into the top 75 greatest players of all time. And his peak season defensively was in 1999, when he averaged 0.7 steals and a monstrous 3.9 blocks. It was a lockout-shortened season, so I think this year doesn't usually get as much respect as it deserves. But he did play in 46 out of the 50 games that year. He was 4th in defensive win shares, and thanks to his leadership, Miami finished 1st in the Atlantic Division with a 33-17 record. Alonzo got postered plenty of times in his career, but that was because he was the epitome of aggressive on defense, as he challenged everything as the rim protector. And if you ask me, that's the kind of teammate you want on your side down low. Number 9, Alvin Robertson in 1986. This San Antonio Spurs legend was one of the most feisty players to ever play on the perimeter. At this point, he was 27 years old, and he averaged a monstrous 3.7 steals, which is an NBA record to this very day. But that wasn't all that he did. That would be crazy enough in itself, but he also averaged 0.5 blocks, which is actually quite impressive, especially for a 6'4" guard. He had availability as he played in 78 of the 82 regular season games. He was 2nd in defensive plus-minus, and among all players who received DPOY votes, Robertson was the leader in defensive win shares. His Spurs barely made it to the playoffs with a 35-47 record, but that wasn't his fault as he was an absolute pest on the perimeter, and was one of the sole reasons why they were able to win some games. Number 8, Dwight Howard in 2009. Prime Dwight Howard was an absolute menace. He had a gravitational pull both offensively and defensively that was pivotal for the Orlando Magic's success, and that year they had plenty of it, as they finished the regular season with a 59-23 record. On the year, he averaged 1 steal and 2.9 blocks. He was able to get those blocks because of his quickness and because of his insane athleticism, equipped with tremendous leaping ability. He was also dominant in advanced analytics, as he was first overall in defensive rating and first overall in defensive win shares. Thanks to Dwight's interior impact, they finished with the #1 ranked defense in the entire league, and that wouldn't have been anywhere close to possible without him. Number 7. Dikembe Mutombo in 1995. Mount Mutombo was an absolute force, especially as a member of the Denver Nuggets, and this season happened to be his absolute peak of his defensive abilities. On the year, he averaged 0.5 steals and 3.9 blocks per game. He was the defensive anchor of that squad, and he contested absolutely everything, and I'm sure he provided plenty of nightmares to opposing offensive players, as he was always sure to cap off his blocked shots with his iconic finger wag. Dikembe had a ridiculously long wingspan, so even for the ones he didn't get a piece of, he certainly altered its trajectory, and for his impact, I believe he certainly deserves a spot on my list. Number 6. Draymond Green in 2017. Unless you play at the center position, it's certainly hard to crack this top 10. But Draymond Green's performance in their historic 2017 season is certainly worth it in my opinion. The Warriors absolutely dominated that season and finished the year with a 67-15 record. They were also ranked second defensively in the league, and most of that credit belongs to their defensive leader, Draymond Green. On the year, he averaged 2 steals and an impressive 1.4 blocks. He was second in defensive win shares and second overall in defensive rating, while being first overall in defensive plus-minus. He did a little bit of everything for that squad defensively, and he also deserves a ton of credit for his defensive IQ and for his verbal leadership on that end. Number 5. David Robinson in 1992. This Spurs team may have only finished with a 47-35 record, but that doesn't change the fact that they had the best defense statistically in the entire league, and we all know who deserves the majority of that credit. On the year, he averaged 2.3 steals and a ridiculous 4.5 blocks. That is the highest combination average of blocks and steals in NBA history. He also had the best defensive plus-minus and by far the best defensive rating in the entire league. I've actually seen some lists that rank David Robinson as high as the #1 spot among the greatest DPOYs of all time. But for myself personally, he only played in 68 of the 82 regular season games, which honestly kept him from being even higher on my list. Because as I've said time and time again, you can only have a defensive impact for the games that you're actually out there, and for 14 games that year, he provided nothing. Number 4. Dennis Rodman in 1991. As usual, Rodman didn't have gaudy stats by any means, but what 91 Rodman did have is arguably the greatest on-ball defense from any player in NBA history. He always played with 100% effort, and he had an endless motor to back it up, as he was simply one of the most athletic players to ever live. He finished 4th overall in defensive rating, and as usual, Rodman was among the league leaders in defensive rebounding. The Detroit Pistons also allowed the fewest points per game of any team that season. And again, we all know where the majority of that credit belongs. Number 3. Mark Eaton in 1985. This 7'4" monster was 28 years old at this point, and although he was usually among the greatest defensive players in the game, this season specifically was especially special. He played all 82 games that year, and on the year, he averaged 0.4 steals and an NBA record 5.6 blocks. That was more than double the second place runner-up, which just happened to be one of the other greatest rim protectors of all time, Hakeem Olajuwon. Despite having only a 41-41 record, Utah still had the best defense in the entire league statistically, and that was thanks to the incredible impact of their center down low. Mark was first in defensive rating, and he was also first in defensive plus-minus. Along with that, he was first overall in defensive win shares. Simply put, he's one of the most underrated and underappreciated rim protectors of all time. And without question, his 1985 campaign was utterly ridiculous. Number 2. Ben Wallace in 2003. He was in his late 20s, and he was making his ascension defensively right as the Detroit Pistons were becoming one of the greatest defensive teams of all time. They were led by Wallace, who was one of the strongest and most intimidating centers of all time. On the year, he averaged 1.4 steals and 3.2 blocks, while commanding tons of respect down low. He also averaged a remarkable 11.4 defensive rebounds per game, which was first in the league overall. He was also first in defensive win shares, first in defensive plus-minus, and first overall in defensive rating. Whether it was the eye test, the basic stats, or the advanced stats, Wallace simply dominated that season to a historic extent. With a 50-32 record, the Pistons finished with the best record in the Eastern Conference, as they were allowing the fewest points per game that season. I debated whether or not this should go in the first or second spot, but this is what I settled on after splitting some hairs. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these players have made the top 10 instead? Number 1. Hakeem Olajuwon in 1993. Hakeem isn't just one of the greatest defensive players and one of the greatest rim protectors of all time, but he's in the argument for being the greatest defensive player of all time. And for what he did in 1993, he's certainly worthy of a top 2 spot in my mind. At the time, he was 30 years old, and he was one of the greatest pickpockets in the entire league, not just at the center position, as he averaged a whopping 1.8 steals, to go along with his tremendous 4.2 blocks. He also accumulated the second most defensive rebounds that season. What is now unheard of by modern NBA standards, he played all 82 games in that regular season. His Rockets finished with a 55-27 record. He was second in defensive rating and second overall in defensive win shares. If you ask me, he's also one of the most versatile defensive players of all time, as he had the speed and lateral quickness to keep up with even some of the perimeter players who challenged him. He had every kind of block shot in his arsenal, whether it was as the main defender, the help defender, or with chase down blocks. Some may argue otherwise, but for myself personally, I think the Dream is deserving of the number 1 spot. Throughout the years, there have been many incredible defensive campaigns from some of the best players of league history, but for one reason or another, many of these campaigns didn't end with the Defensive Player of the Year award. Now before we get into the list, let me first establish my 2 rules of this list. Each player only has 1 spot on the list, so I will only rank a player's best season in which he did not win the Defensive Player of the Year award. This should give a nice variety to the list. The other rule is that only seasons where the award actually existed are eligible to make this list. So basically, starting with the year 1983. Also, these are the honorable mentions of the greatest non-DPOY seasons that didn't make the list. Let me know which one of these has the best case to get into the top 10. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 10. Dwight Howard in the 11-12 season. Between 2009 and 2011, Howard absolutely dominated this defensive accolade as he earned the trophy for 3 seasons straight, which no other player has ever done. By the time the 2012 season rolled around, voter fatigue may have been playing a part in Howard's vote total, as Tyson Chandler was that season's winner. Although Chandler was certainly deserving of the award, Dwight put up a strong campaign of his own, nearly becoming the first ever player to win 4 straight DPOY trophies. This season, Howard led the league in defensive rebounds and was 3rd in blocks per game, which was ahead of Tyson Chandler. He was also 3rd in defensive rating and 3rd in defensive win shares. On top of all of this, he was also selected to the NBA's first team All-Defense, compared to Chandler, who was only selected to the second team, which only makes things a little more awkward about the league's decision to give the award to Chandler over Howard. Number 9. LeBron James in the 12-13 season. If this list was about the biggest DPOY snubs ever, then this campaign from LeBron would certainly be in my top 5. But since it's just the greatest non-DPOY seasons overall, LeBron will have to settle for the 9th spot on my list. This is one of the more famous controversies as far as this award goes, since Marc Gasol was selected as the winner, yet he only made the 2nd All-Defense team, while LeBron made 1st team All-Defense. LeBron was the defensive anchor of his 66-16 Heat squad, and had the best defensive rating out of all players on his team. Number 8. Tree Rollins in the 82-83 season. The 7'1" Rollins is one of the great forgotten rim protectors of NBA history, and in the 1983 season, he was at his very best. The great perimeter defender Sidney Moncrief was awarded that season's award, but it easily could have gone to Rollins, who finished as a close second, as he put up 0.6 steals and a ridiculous league-leading 4.3 blocks per game. What's even more amazing is how Rollins did that in only 30.9 minutes per game. His per 36-minute stats puts his block shots at a whopping 5 per game. His middle-of-the-pack Atlanta Hawks was just barely better than half of the league defensively. But Rollins definitely did his part, as he finished 8th in defensive win shares, 2nd in defensive plus-minus, and 3rd overall in defensive rating. Number 7. Draymond Green in the 14-15 season. Kawhi Leonard was that season's winner, and the selection is remembered as one of the most controversial awards of NBA history, and for good reason, as Draymond was the defensive leader of the 67-15 Warriors' number 1 ranked defense. He averaged a solid 1.6 steals and 1.3 blocks per game. But a lot of what Draymond does well defensively goes beyond the numbers, as he's an elite help defender, a fantastic on-ball defender, and one of the premier low-post defenders, despite usually being the undersized player. He was also 2nd overall in defensive win shares and 4th overall in defensive rating. Number 6. Tim Duncan in the 06-07 season. If there was ever a season where Tim Duncan should have won the Defensive Player of the Year award, this was it, as his San Antonio Spurs finished as the 2nd best defense in the entire league, and Duncan was the clear leader of that San Antonio unit, as he averaged 0.8 steals and 2.4 blocks. Marcus Camby was that season's Defensive Player of the Year, but despite that, Duncan ranked ahead of him in terms of defensive win shares and defensive rating, as the big fundamental had the top spot in the league in each of those categories. Number 5. Mark Eaton in the 83-84 season. It was once again the elite defensive guard Sidney Moncrief who narrowly won the award. Now the 1984 Jazz was just a middle-of-the-road team both overall and defensively, but their monstrous defender in the paint was the exception, and with his sheer size and with his 7'6" wingspan, the 7'4" center was putting up defensive numbers that modern bigs can only dream of. In only 26.1 minutes per game, Mark averaged 0.3 steals and 4.3 blocks per game, which translates to 5.9 blocks per 36 minutes. Despite a role player's amount of minutes, he easily led all players this season in blocks, blocks percentage, and defensive plus-minus. He would later go on to win 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards in his career, but very nearly started with his 3rd this season. Number 4. Scottie Pippen in the 94-95 season. I debated whether to go with Scottie's 1996 campaign or this one in 1995, but ultimately this is the one I settled with. This season, not only did Scottie lead his Bulls in all 5 major stat categories, which only 5 players have ever done in league history, but he also led the NBA in steals with 2.9 per game, which was his career best. He also added 1.1 blocks per game, and his Bulls finished with the 2nd best defense in the entire league. Scottie had the 2nd most defensive win shares and 3rd best defensive plus-minus, and had the best defensive rating in the entire league, even against competition like Dikembe Mutombo, David Robinson, Patrick Ewing, Dennis Rodman, and Hakeem Olajuwon. With his strong numbers, Dikembe Mutombo was that season's winner. Due to the quality of his rim protection, he may have been more deserving of the award. It's tough to say, but without question, this season from Scottie was one of the greatest that we've ever seen from a wing defender. Number 3. David Robinson in the 90-91 season. Dennis Rodman won the award over Robinson, which made the Admiral one of the greatest runner-ups of league history. But whether or not he should have been is another topic entirely, as he led his Spurs to a 55-27 record and San Antonio had the best team defense in the entire league. As far as the stats advantage goes, Robinson absolutely crushed Rodman, with 1.5 steals and 3.9 blocks per game. Robinson also bested Rodman in defensive win shares, defensive plus-minus, defensive rating, and even in defensive rebounds. If you consider the fact that Robinson had won the Defensive Player of the Year award in his career, this runner-up season still might be the most impressive he ever was on the defensive end of the court. Number 2. Ben Wallace in the 03-04 season. The 2004 Pistons are arguably the greatest defensive team in NBA history, and the top defender of that group was none other than Ben Wallace. This season was sandwiched between the 2 Defensive Player of the Years before this season and his 2 Defensive Player of the Years after this season, which means that if he won the award this year, he would have won 5 straight Defensive Player of the Year awards. And if I'm being honest, I think he should have. The man formerly known as Ron Artest won the award this season, and that may have something to do with the fact that his Pacers had the league best 61-21 record. But by pretty much every defensive metric, Ben Wallace had a significant edge over Artest. Wallace averaged 1.8 steals and 3 blocks while having a better defensive rating, more win shares, and a better defensive plus-minus than Ron Artest. In fact, not only did Wallace have the most defensive win shares that season, but since the DPOY was introduced in 1983, Ben Wallace in 2004 had the most defensive win shares in NBA history. When it's all said and done, I still don't understand how he didn't win the award this season. Number 1. Hakeem Olajuwon in the 89-90 season. Once again, Dennis Rodman was the winner of the award this year, but to say that the runner-up had a strong case would be a massive understatement. This top spot was honestly an easy choice for me, as Hakeem dominated in basically every way you can defensively. His Rockets were the number 1 ranked defense as he put up 2.1 steals and an insane 4.6 blocks over the course of the year. In a season stacked with great defenders, Hakeem was first in defensive rebounds, first in block shots, first among centers in steals, first in defensive win shares, first in defensive plus-minus, and first in defensive rating. Second in the Defensive Player of the Year race. Go figure. More often than not, it's offensive players who win the MVP awards and who get all of the attention. But make no mistake, the defensive end of the court deserves more credit, as it's literally half of the game. Today, I'm breaking down my list of the top 10 greatest defensive players in NBA history, and let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with these choices. Before I get into it, let me first explain how my list works. Although defensive accolades are important, they are not the only major factor, as they're given based on the media members voting, which I might not necessarily agree with. The defensive awards also have a lot to do with who they were up against, so obviously, if the competition was stronger, then it's harder to win the award on a yearly basis. And lastly, this list is a combination of peak defensive abilities and longevity. For example, a player like Mark Eaton was one of the greatest rim protectors in his prime, but he had a relatively shorter career. When you compare his 10 seasons of elite defense to Tim Duncan's 19, well then it's obvious who's making the list and who isn't. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 10, Michael Jordan. MJ is the only guard to make my list, which really tells you just how difficult it is for a perimeter defender to stand out amongst the crowd. MJ deserves the spot though, as he was an absolute menace to opposing guards. He was first team all-defense a total of 9 times, which is tied for the most in NBA history. Among guards, he has the highest blocks per game average in NBA history, and he's currently 4th on the all-time list in total steals, regardless of the fact that he played fewer seasons than most of the players in the top 25. At his best, he won the Defensive Player of the Year in 1988, where he averaged 3.2 steals and 1.6 blocks, which made him first overall in steals per game and first among guards in blocks per game. Number 9. Ben Wallace. His longevity may have not been enough to get him in the top 5, but his peak was certainly enough to get him in the top 10. This 6'9" center/power forward was one of the strongest players to ever do it, and he was one of the few men who could actually do a decent job of containing a prime Shaquille O'Neal. His best years were on the suffocating Detroit Pistons of the mid-2000s, and it was during this stretch that he won the Defensive Player of the Year award 4 times in a span of 5 seasons. Regardless of the fact that he was relatively undersized as a center, he was still able to be a solid shot blocker, leading the league overall in the 2002 season. He was also solid at stripping the ball from the opponent, as he averaged 1.3 steals over the course of his career. In total, he made 6 All-Defense teams, which is actually the fewest of all eligible players on my list. And as I mentioned before, that was a product of his lack of elite longevity. But when he was at his best, there are very few defenders more intimidating than Wallace. Number 8. Scottie Pippen. Although Michael Jordan may have averaged slightly more steals and more blocks, there was no question that Pippen was the most smothering on-ball defender for their 6 championship runs. Somehow, Scottie never won the Defensive Player of the Year award, which was probably a product of there being so many all-time great defensive centers in his era, but Pippen was the runner-up to Dikembe Mutombo in 1995 and to Gary Payton in 1996. In the totality of his career, Pippen made 10 All-Defense teams, and 8 of those selections were first team, which ties him for the 5th most in NBA history. Within his complete body of work were some key moments where Pippen displayed his abilities, like when he took on the assignment of defending and containing Magic Johnson in the 1991 NBA Finals. Number 7. Tim Duncan. Just like Pippen, Duncan never won the Defensive Player of the Year award, as he never led the league in steals or blocks. And with Bruce Bowen on his team for some years, you could even argue that there were stretches where he wasn't even the best defensive player on his team. But for what Duncan lacked in peak performance, he made up for it with his insane longevity and consistency. For his career, Duncan earned a whopping total of 15 All-Defense Team selections in his 19 years of pro basketball. That's easily the most selections in NBA history. Many players enjoy being an elite defender in their 20s, but Duncan carried that tremendous impact into his late 30s, as his intelligence and rim protection was a pivotal aspect of their final championship run in 2014. Number 6. Kevin Garnett. Especially during his time in Minnesota, the big ticket was a nightmare for opposing teams, as he was always bringing the energy and intensity on defense. Like the legendary Hakeem Olajuwon, Garnett was usually among the league leaders in blocks and steals simultaneously. For many years, his elite defense appeared to go unnoticed, but in his first season as a member of the contending Boston Celtics, he was rewarded with the Defensive Player of the Year. In total, he made 12 All-Defense teams, which is tied for the second most of all time, and 9 of those were first team, which is tied with Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and Gary Payton for the most of all time. Add in the fact that he shut the Lakers down in the paint during the 2008 championship run, and I'm very comfortable having Garnett just outside my top 5. Number 5. David Robinson. Well before the big fundamental was locking down the paint for San Antonio, the Admiral was doing it at a higher level. Over a 6-season stretch from 1990 to 1996, Robinson was averaging a monstrous 3.6 blocks per game. All-time great rim protectors like Tim Duncan and Dwight Howard never had a single season where they averaged that many blocks per game, and Robinson did it over a 6-year stretch. He was also regularly among the league leaders in steals per game, regardless of the fact that he played at the center position, and he got as high as 2.3 steals per game in 1992, which was 5th in the league overall. He was the Defensive Player of the Year in 1992, and he earned a total of 8 All-Defense teams. Due to his service in the US Navy, Robinson didn't debut in his rookie season until the age of 24, and if he had got an earlier start to his career like many players do, then he would likely have even more defensive accolades than he already does. Number 4. Wilt Chamberlain. He's most famous for his accomplishments on offense, but Wilt was arguably just as dominant on the defensive end of the court. Since blocks and steals were not officially tracked until 1973, it's basically impossible to accurately estimate his defensive numbers over the entirety of his career. With that being said, Wilt's blocks were unofficially tracked over a 112-game span, and he averaged a mind-blowing 8.8 blocks over that stretch. Obviously, blocked shots are difficult to compare across eras, considering numerous variables, like how the three-point line didn't exist yet. But regardless, that's still insanely impressive no matter how you slice it. There are many examples of Wilt controlling games defensively. Some may say that he should be in the number 1 spot, based on his insane numbers and reputation. But I would disagree, as Wilt also had a bit of a reputation for occasionally taking some nights off defensively. Nonetheless, I certainly believe he deserves a spot in the top 5. Number 3. Dennis Rodman. The Worm's case defensively is a bit more complicated than some people may realize. Statistically, he was nothing to marvel at, as he has never had a single season where he averaged at least 1 block or 1 steal. What he did well though was frustrate the offensive player with his smothering on-ball defense, and force him into either a bad shot or into passing the basketball. I also believe that Rodman had the most versatile defensive career of all time. At different points in history, he was assigned a guard the best player from every position on the court. In the 80s, he was asked to guard Magic Johnson at point guard, Michael Jordan at shooting guard, and Larry Bird at small forward. And then in the 90s, he was asked to guard Karl Malone at power forward and Shaquille O'Neal at center. And Rodman did more than an adequate job of all of those tasks. In his career, he made a total of 8 All-Defense teams, and he won the Defensive Player of the Year in back-to-back seasons as a member of the Bad Boy Pistons. Number 2. Hakeem Olajuwon. I've said it once, I'll say it again. The Dream was an absolute nightmare on defense, as he had the length, athleticism, and intelligence to be one of the select few greatest defenders ever. Officially, he's the NBA's all-time leader in blocked shots, and second place isn't even close. On top of that, he's currently 10th on the NBA's all-time list in total steals, which is completely insane for a center. The closest center to Hakeem is David Robinson, who is 54 spots below him on the all-time list. Over his career, Hakeem made 9 all-defense teams, and he won the Defensive Player of the Year twice. It is worth mentioning that he finished in the top 3 of the Defensive Player of the Year voting a whopping 6 times. A couple things that are rarely appreciated about Hakeem was his chase down speed and his lateral quickness, which helped him block and contest many shots from speedy guards and wings. He was truly the standard of defensive excellence in the 1990s. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Feel free to pause the video for a longer look. Should any of these players have made it into the top 10? Let me know below. Number 1. Bill Russell. Back when Russell and the Celtics dominated the NBA, the Defensive Player of the Year did not exist yet, so because of this, they often gave him the MVP award instead. Russell was a relentless competitor, and with his Olympian level of athleticism, he established himself as arguably the greatest rim protector in the history of the game. Just like Wilt Chamberlain, who I mentioned earlier, Bill Russell's blocks and steals were never officially tracked, but that doesn't entirely mean that we couldn't gauge his defensive impact. In 11 out of his 13 seasons in the NBA, Russell led the league in defensive win shares. That's more than doubled second place, which is George Mikan and Tim Duncan with 5. The most Defensive Player of the Year awards by one player is a total of 4, which is an honor shared by Ben Wallace and Dikembe Mutombo. If that award had existed during Bill Russell's era, then he likely would have at least doubled that total. Bill Russell built a legacy for himself and won 11 championships with defense as his greatest skill set, in the same era that Wilt Chamberlain played in the NBA. If that isn't a strong case for being the greatest defender of all time, then I don't know what is. If you've made it to the end of this tremendously long video, I deeply thank you. And before you head out, make sure to hit that like button because this video took a long time to make and a lot of research. But also let me know in the comments section below, how would your list differ from mine? Who are some players that you thought should have won the award instead? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.